How did blacks perform as soldiers during the Civil War? Did they shrink from fear, as some hoped they would? Did they fight fiercely, or was it a combination of both? Did they act in any way different from their white counterparts? This is what we're looking to answer, and we'll be studying from Dr. Litwack's 1979 book, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery. Let's beginneth.
By the end of the Civil War, more than 186,000 black men, most of them 134,111, recruited or conscripted in the slave states, had served in the Union Army, comprising nearly 10% of the total enrollment.
A significant portion of the armed force, for sure.
Almost as many blacks, men and women, mostly freedmen, were employed as teamsters, carpenters, cooks, nurses, laundresses, stevedores, blacksmiths, coopers, bridge builders, laborers, servants, spies, scouts, and guides.
Similar to how they were used on the side of the Confederates.
This army would be like a one-handed man, without
a Union soldier conceded,
letting it be known that he believed blacks were essential to the Union Army.
We have 2 regiments of fighting nigs and as many more of diggers. The nigs work all night, every night, planting guns and building breastworks.
There they go again, creating more identities for people who did not agree to be called that.
Among both the soldiers and the laborers, the Civil War exacted a heavy price in human lives. Some 1/3 of the black soldiers, an estimated 68,178 men, were listed as dead and missing, 2,751 of them killed in combat.
That's a lot of death. 1/3 of Negroes who enlisted not making it is devastating. And according to these stats, most of them didn't die from the bullet. So how did they?
For both white and black soldiers, the overwhelming majority of deaths resulted from disease rather than military action.
Disease, which findeth its way in the human body.
Among the more unglamorous statistics of the Civil War is the fact that deaths from diarrhea and dysentery alone exceeded those killed in battle, and most diseases did not discriminate according to race any more than enemy fire in their devastation of the ranks. Despite the claim that blacks were less susceptible to diseases which felled whites, the death rate from disease was nearly 3 times as great for black soldiers as for whites.
That suggestion was made by both black and white intellectuals at the time. They claimed that blacks were fit for the battleground in the South because they were less susceptible to the disease in the area, which turned out to be false, since death by disease was nearly 3 times greater for blacks than it was for whites.
When blacks were first recruited, considerable doubt prevailed as to how they would perform as soldiers, particularly under enemy fire.
Many hope they will prove cowards and sneaks.
A New York newspaper perceived, while
others greatly fear it.
Many hoped they would cower because that would provide supportive evidence for ideas of white superiority and black inferiority. And others feared they would cower because that would jeopardize the lives of other soldiers.
2 years of experience with black troops made believers of most of the doubters. The evaluations made by Union officers, while agreeing rather remarkably on the military capabilities of blacks, also revealed that the very qualities often stressed in racial stereotypes as marking blacks different from, hence inferior to, whites made them commendable soldiers. Since they were
more docile and obedient,
blacks were thought to be easier to control and command.
They came prepackaged for military service was the understanding. And part of the core training for enlisted members is to make manifest in them the trait of obedience. And because of that, recruit training for enlisted members is completely different than what officers go through because the objectives are different. Officers are primarily trained to lead, and enlisted primarily trained to follow. And since blacks had already been conditioned thoroughly to obey whites, they found them to make good soldiers.
Their docility, their habits of unquestioning obedience,
one soldier observed,
preeminently fit them for soldiers. To a Negro, an order means obedience in spirit as well as letter.
Meaning they didn't just obey robotically. They obeyed wholeheartedly with a genuine willingness to do so. That's what this soldier observed.
Accustomed as they were to menial labor, black soldiers were found to work more constantly and obediently than whites, and to offer fewer complaints and excuses. Although blacks were considered to be excessive in their religious worship,
their singing, praying, and shouting in camp had to be arrested sometimes at the point of the bayonet.
This characteristic, too, could be viewed as a military virtue.
And even with all the singing, praying, and shouting, they still died at nearly 3 times as much as the whites did, who were not doing any of that, right? I want you to think about that, because this is reality we're talking about now. And the world works different than what many of us were tricked into believing. But besides that, their religious sentiment was looked at as a military virtue.
The fact that blacks were
a religious people
suggested to one Union officer
another high quality for making good soldiers.
While it prompted Major General David Hunter, who had organized the first slave regiment in South Carolina, to observe that
religious sentiment, call it fanaticism, such as you like, made the soldiers of Cromwell invincible.
That's Oliver Cromwell from England, who led a Puritan army backed with the religious zeal. When you add religion behind an intention, it acts as an amplifier. It doesn't mean that the religion is objectively true, but it does serve as a major booster when people truly believe it. That's the effect that it had on Cromwell's soldiers that made them invincible in the eyes of this general, right? Let's continue.
The white man had also conceded to blacks a natural gift for music and rhythm, and this helped to explain their aptness for military drill and marching.
In mere drill, they must beat the whites.
One soldier conceded.
For time, which is so important an item in drilling, is a universal gift to them.
But even if blacks clearly had the potential for becoming good soldiers, the assumption prevailed that only white men could properly lead them, largely because blacks were accustomed to obeying whites and had too little regard for their own race.
They certainly need white officers for a while, and the best of officers too.
A sympathetic white soldier argued.
For they will, like children, lean much on their superiors.
Although former slaves made up the largest portion of black troops, disagreement prevailed over whether they were better soldiers than the northern blacks who had never experienced bondage. Ignoring the question of motivation, which black commentators usually cited, a Union officer from New York thought the northern blacks had more self-reliance and came closer
to the qualities of the white man in respect to dash and energy.
Several other officers in his unit concurred with this judgment, and they unanimously agreed that slaves were less desirable as soldiers. The most vigorous defense of the slave as soldier was made by Colonel Higginson, whose South Carolina regiment consisted almost exclusively of recently held bondsmen.
This is the same Higginson who we've been hearing from, who was friends with John Brown and loved commanding the Negro troops.
He preferred them as soldiers, he explained, because of
their greater docility and affectionateness,
and
the powerful stimulus
which prompted men to fight for their own homes and families. The demeanor of his men, moreover, he considered superior to
that sort of upstart conceit which is sometimes offensive among free Negroes at the North, the dandy barber strut.
He preferred the ex-slaves instead of the northern Negroes, who he believed had a certain confidence that was offensive to many whites, and they walked with a sense of self-pride. And for some reason, he did not like those qualities in his troops, and he preferred docile and affectionate Negroes.
But Higginson refused to argue, as did some Union officers, that slavery with its emphasis on submission and obedience had prepared slaves for military service.
Experience proved the contrary,
he insisted.
The more strongly we mark the difference between the slave and the soldier, the better for the regiment. One half of military duty lies in obedience, the other half in self-respect. A soldier without self-respect is worthless.
The prevailing assessment of the black soldier in combat was that he conducted himself as well as the white man. That in itself was a substantial concession.
These were the small cracks that began the process of breaking down the system of white supremacy. It's little concessions like these that eventually add up over time to where their old ideas have to make room for completely new ones.
They seem to have behaved just as well and as badly as the rest, and to have suffered more severely,
concluded a white officer who but 2 years earlier had warned that the use of blacks as soldiers would be a serious blunder, like Hamlet's ape who broke his neck to try conclusions.
You see that? But at least he was honest and corrected his assumption, which he should be credited for.
Some black soldiers deserted under fire, though proportionately fewer than in the white regiments,
which we have heard from the mouths of a few officers in the previous commentaries.
Both white and black soldiers shared a capacity for incredible valor. 17 black soldiers and 4 black sailors were awarded Congressional Medals of Honor, battle fatigue, and outright fear.
The Medal of Honor is the highest award that can be received by a military member, and you have to do something extremely brave to get one of these. They don't hand these out like candy or because of skin color. So these gentlemen must have done something tremendously honorable to get this. And that goes for both the blacks and whites, who as a group showed valor, fatigue, and fear.
I prayed on the battlefield some of the best prayers I ever prayed in my life.
One black soldier readily confessed,
and made God some of the finest promises that were ever made.
I promise I won't eat no more pork. I'll do right by my wife. I'll put down the whiskey, right? All these types of promises made in order to make it back from the battlefield.
And for some blacks, as for whites, the level of violence and inhumanity reached in this war was too much to bear.
I sure wishes lots of times I never run off from the plantation.
This is wild, isn't it?
I begs the general not to send me on any more battles, and he says I's the coward and sympathizes with the South. But I tells him, I just couldn't stand to see all them men laying there dying and hollering and begging for help and a drink of water, and blood everywhere you looks.
But when it came down to the real test, most of the black soldiers fought, and many of them died, and that was all the evidence most observers required.
There you go.
Nor did the black soldier who had been a slave evince any hesitation about facing his former master in the field of combat.
Come on with it.
Our masters may talk now all they choose,
A black soldier replied, when told that slaves loved their old masters too much to fight them.
but one thing is certain, they don't dare to try us. Just put the guns into our hands, and you'll soon see that we not only knows how to shoot, but who to shoot.
Oh, snaps. And he was serious too.
The fact that black men had played a significant role in liberating their enslaved brethren and preserving the Union would remain a source of considerable pride, even as it led them to expect much of the future. Once the war ended, the black soldier expected that a grateful nation would accord him and his people the rights of American citizens. He had demonstrated his loyalty. He had fought for his country's survival. On the battlefields of the South, at Port Hudson, Battery Wagner, Milliken's Bend, Olustee, and Petersburg, he had disproved those widely held notions about his inability to handle firearms or meet the test of fire. What more could white Americans expect of him? Like any victor, was he not entitled to share in the triumph? If he expected much of the United States, it was because he had served its citizens well. Reflecting upon the role of blacks in the war, Thomas Long, a former slave and a private in the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, suggested to the men of his regiment that they had faced and surmounted obstacles almost unprecedented in the history of warfare, the test of enemy fire, and the suspicions and hostility of their own comrades.
If we hadn't become soldiers, all might have gone back as it was before. Our freedom might have slipped through the 2 houses of Congress, and President Lincoln's 4 years might have passed by and naught been done for us. But now things can never go back because we have showed our energy and our courage and our naturally manhood.
Whatever happened to them after the war, Private Long declared, the memory of their participation in that conflict would be handed down to future generations of black people.
Suppose,
he speculated,
you had kept your freedom without enlisting in this army. Your children might have grown up free and been well cultivated so as to be equal to any business, but it would have been always flung in their faces. Your father never fought for he owned freedom, and what could they answer? Never can say that to this African race anymore.
And that was one of the reasons why it was important to have men from this background join the fight, right? A lot of them died in the war, but it was a necessary sacrifice. And it helped move the country one step further out of the pit, right? We continue it to the next. I thank you for your time. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.